illegal aliens, gang members, hardened criminals, terrorists, very bad people, swarms of migrants, an invasion, threats to our national security. Our military is waiting for you.
These are the words that surround what the world has deemed a global migrant crisis. These words are as dehumanizing as they are fear-inducing. They place the blame squarely on the shoulders of the migrants. It is the migrants that are to be feared. It is the migrants causing this problem. Today, there are more than 65 million displaced people around the world. This is roughly the population size of the United Kingdom. This is more displaced people than ever before in recorded history. But rather than call this a migrant crisis, we call this a crisis of humanity. The global response has lacked self-reflection, empathy, and sustainable solutions. Instead, we focused on walls and borders and ways of keeping people out. My name is Letitia Basford, and I'm a professor here at Hamline University.
And I'm Sejla Ceric, and I'm a student here.
In the fall of 2018, I had the great privilege of taking students like Sejla to Europe to study how the continent has responded to the millions of migrants seeking refuge there, especially after Syrian war broke out in 2011. We also looked at how the United States has been responding to the thousands of Central American migrants hoping to claim asylum here in the US. Today, we'll talk about why this crisis is occurring and what can be done to re-instill humanity to the situation. So, what's going on? Why so much fragility? To unpack these questions, we offer three true stories that we feel highlight the geopolitical crisis of the situation today.
Our first story is about a little boy named Gawali. Between the Cold War and 9/11, his country, Afghanistan, has been inundated with weapons and at war as the US and USSR propagated their political agendas. But when things didn't go as planned, these countries retreated, leaving Afghanistan loaded with weapons and a power vacuum that would soon be led to the Taliban. After his father and grandfather were killed, Gawali's mother realized that her 12-year-old son would be next. Leaving everything he knew behind, he was forced to rely on a smuggler and embark on a treacherous year-long journey to seek refuge in England. Repeated in his mind was his mother's voice saying, "However bad it gets, don't come back."
In a similar situation is 16-year-old Enrique from Central America. He's not alive during the 1980s when the US sent military advisors and hundreds of millions of dollars to help right-wing dictators overthrow left-wing governments. However, the geopolitical consequences of that intervention affect his life today, where his country's government is weak, drug cartels are strong, and corruption and gang violence is rampant. In El Salvador today, more than 500,000 people are involved in gangs, many born out of the streets of Los Angeles, contributing to what is the highest murder rate in the world for people under the age of 19. Enrique strove to escape the violence that surrounded him.
Our third story highlights the impacts of a more contemporary global movement, that of the Arab Spring. While the West was eager to encourage the Middle East to rid themselves of their ruthless dictators, we did little to support true democracies from taking hold. Without strong leadership that promotes unity between groups, instability in the promotion of extremist ideology can occur. Hashim comes from Syria, a country destroyed by war that was a result of this instability. All that is left of his home is the key in his pocket. He has learned that places like Germany will offer refuge to Syrians, but only if they can get there. Desperate to find safety for his family, Hashim left to seek refuge for them in Europe. His perilous 2-year-long journey motivated only by his desire to save his wife and children.
So when the West, and Americans in particular, look at what drives a migrant crisis, it's critical that we look at our role between their part of the world and our own. We must subsequently ask, what responsibility is it of ours to provide both refuge and solutions? While millions of migrants like Guwali and Enrique flee their volatile homelands for safer places, only those that qualify as refugees receive support and shelter under the 1951 Refugee Convention. Refugees are defined as people fleeing war and persecution, and Syrians like Hashim qualify for this support. But only 25 million of the more than 65 million displaced people around the world are considered refugees. Even though Guwali is from what the world has deemed the most dangerous country, and Enrique is fleeing one of the murder capitals of the world, migrants like them do not receive the same protection or resources.
Which begs us to ask, do refugees have good reasons to leave and migrants do not? And do refugees deserve rights, but migrants do not?
It may be surprising to learn that neither the US nor any country in Europe ranks in the top 10 countries hosting the most refugees. Instead, much poorer countries like Jordan, Turkey, and Pakistan host the most. Jordan's refugees equal 1/10 of their entire population. But at a time when there's more displaced people than in recorded history, global funding for these refugees has actually been going down, burdening these poorer nations. Hashim could have taken his family to a refugee camp like this one in Jordan. But refugees soon learn that in these camps, there are no legal right to work, they have limited access to education, they often live in inhumane housing, and can be stuck in limbo for up to decades. In fact, it's been reported that the average refugee lives in a camp for 17 years. It's no wonder that many leave in hopes of what they hope will be better opportunities in the West.
Yet, in order to get to the West, refugees must join other migrants as they embark on deadly and dangerous routes. Enrique clung to the sides of what is called the train of death to get to the US. He was robbed, threatened, and held for ransom by his smugglers. But he was lucky. He survived. In the past 2 decades, as many as 10,000 migrants have died trying to cross the US-Mexico border. As many as 6 in 10 women and children are raped on their journeys. Hashim and Guwali nearly drowned taking the Mediterranean route, which has been deemed the world's most dangerous border. Since 2000, nearly 33,000 migrants have died at sea, in flimsy rafts and with fake life vests, trying to enter Europe. And it's only when images like this were seen did the world seem to show much empathy. In total, more than 60,000 migrant deaths have been recorded globally since the year 2000.
Allow me to repeat that. More than 60,000 migrants have died since the year 2000. This is a crisis of our humanity. And how has the West responded? Thus far, with fear. Across Europe, anti-immigrant and nationalist parties have made significant gains in countries like Italy, Germany, France, Poland, Sweden, Austria, Slovenia. England voted to exit from the European Union, and Hungary now criminalizes people who try to help migrants seek asylum.
In Australia, migrant boat people are returned back to sea, and asylum seekers are taken to remote Pacific Island detention centers described as open prisons.
In the US, President Trump was elected and vowed to crack down on immigration. He's declared the border a national emergency. He's separated children from their families. He's sent thousands of National Guard troops down to police the border. He's currently talking about completely shutting down the border. Yet regardless of these responses by the West, the migrants continue to come. Regardless of the life-threatening journeys they face in order to get here, they come. Regardless of the hostile, openly racist, Islamophobic treatment they experience in the West, they come. They may arrive without the legal right to work. They may live in abject poverty. But we ask you, if your village was threatened by the Boko Haram, or your children's lives were threatened by gang members, Wouldn't you do the same? Yes, this is a crisis, but it's a crisis of our humanity, what Pope John Francis calls the globalization of indifference. We must do better.
So, how should we respond? When the world is facing the largest number of displaced people in recorded history, it is critical that we return to discussion about who qualifies for support and who does not. The 1951 UN Refugee Convention was created after World War II and does not adequately address today's displacement issues. The Gowalis and Enriques of the world must be considered. Furthermore, it is unacceptable that the funding for the support of refugees is actually decreasing and burdening poorer nations that host more refugees. Our world's more privileged nations must contribute more.
Rather than seeing refugees as a burden, host countries could implement policies in refugee camps that economically benefit both refugees and themselves. Take Uganda, a country that hosts a large number of refugees. In Uganda, refugees, unlike most host countries, are given the right to work, access capital, banking, land, education, and freedom of movement. As a result, these refugees are faring well, actually contributing to jobs for Ugandan citizens. What if we created national development projects like the New Deal programs that President Roosevelt created for desperate Americans during the Great Depression? One such project is actually being tried in Jordan today, offering Syrian refugees the right to work in exchange for much-needed international investment. With funding from places like the World Bank and careful assurance that human rights are respected, these policies could create economic benefits for both refugee and host country.
We need to invest in education, in refugee camps, and along borders where migrants wait to apply for asylum. Currently, just half of the world's refugee children of primary school age get access to education. Adults also need to develop the skills necessary to rebuild their countries. An investment in education creates a more peaceful future for all of us.
For migrants stuck in limbo, without the hope of returning to their volatile homelands, the world needs to take its fair share of migrants and do so in thoughtful collaboration with one another. The West needs to create a shared system that takes into account a country's gross domestic product and population size to determine appropriate capacity for each nation. Reforms like this are being discussed in the European Union, but should be done on a global scale.
And importantly, we must look inward. If a country like ours created foreign policy errors that contributed to the disorder before us, then our responsibility is greater. We have a duty to help resolve this disorder and encourage better conditions in these countries so that people can return.
Finally, on an individual level, you can educate yourself. In our talk with you, we've drawn from 3 influential books that highlight the true stories of Gowali and Enrique and Hashim. Read books like these to better understand this incredibly important issue of our time.
We have one last story to conclude with, my own story. I'll be sharing the experiences of my mother, who I'm honored to have in the audience today. My mother comes from Bosnia, a region scourged by war in the 90s, where as many as 200,000 people were killed and 2 million were displaced. The Muslim community in specific were targeted in an ethnic cleansing campaign. It was the worst genocide on European soil since the Holocaust. After my mother's husband was shot by Serb forces, she was left alone with 2 small children. Her father was thrown into a concentration camp. Her brother was killed by a bomb. Living in a war zone, hearing the sound of snipers more times than they could count, she fled her home with her son and daughter at her side, not knowing what the fate of the people she left behind would be. After living in Croatia for 6 months, my mother was forced to rely on a smuggler to get them into Switzerland. There, she was provided food and housing, but not allowed to work. She also met my father, another Bosnian refugee, and my sisters and I were born. For 7 years, my parents waited, never knowing when we might be expelled from Switzerland. But in October of 1999, we were granted permanent residency in the US, and we came to Minneapolis to start a new life. Today, my family is able to study, travel, work, and live without the fear of being persecuted for our identity or evicted from our home. We are able to live a safe life, a life full of promise and opportunity. I'm a month away from graduating university, eager to help out other vulnerable populations like my own. We are good people, my family and I, and so are the 65 million others deserving of our compassion and humanity now.
These are not terrorists or hardened criminals. They are not gang members or very bad people. This is not an invasion, nor should these people be met with military force. These are people like you and I, but they are escaping war and violence and destitution. We can do better. We can do the right thing. Thank you.
Thank you.